This is a photo of 5 men in a displaced persons camp, which was a camp that many survivors of the Holocaust went to after the war ended because they had lost all connection with their home. Many of them had been uprooted from their communities when the Nazis overtook their hometowns, and all connections had been lost. Many of their family members had perished during the war. And so these camps were places where people who were displaced, as the name suggests, went until they were able to find either connections to their family, to their town, or able to emigrate elsewhere. But that was very difficult to do so during this time. The man second from the left is named Henry Greenbaum, and he was a Polish Jew who was born in Poland in 1928. And he was one of 9 children. Before the war, he had a very typical childhood. He loved soccer, playing with his friends. But as word of the Nazi occupation of Poland started to approach, his family got worried, and ultimately his father passed away unexpectedly, and his mother sent Henry and 3 of his sisters to go work in a factory, which was believed to be safer if Nazis did overtake or occupy Poland. And ultimately, when they did, his entire family moved out to a farm to avoid the bombing. And while Henry was out on the farm one day picking tomatoes with his brother, they ran into a Polish soldier who was running away from the German troops. And Henry's brother decided to run and escape with him. And Henry was left with his family and still continued to work at the factory. And ultimately, Henry, his mother, and a few of his sisters were moved into a ghetto where his mother and some of his sisters perished in this ghetto. They were deported to a killing center. And Henry and his remaining sisters were then moved from the ghetto to a concentration camp where they became slave and forced laborers. And during this time, Henry and his sister decided that they would like to escape. And when they were trying to escape, they raised the alarm of Nazi guards, and ultimately they were not able to do so. Henry was shot in the head, and someone from the camp, who turned out later to be a relative of his, hid him that night and tried to help him with his wound, the bullet wound to his head. And when Henry woke up the next day in the morning, he realized that his sister had died during the escape attempt. So at this point, Henry had seen his mother and multiple sisters of his die at the hands of the Nazi regime. And Henry continued to work at this camp. Ultimately, he moved on and became a forced laborer at another camp. And then at 1945, as the war effort began to end and United States and Soviet Union troops began to move into Nazi-occupied territory, Henry, along with many other forced laborers, were sent on death marches, which were forced walks of slave laborers deeper into Nazi-controlled territory to evade the approaching U.S. and Soviet Union troops. And it was upon one of these marches that Henry's group, by chance, ran into American soldiers who had come to liberate them. And as Henry remembers, this tank approached and a United States soldier popped out of the top of it and held up a thumbs up sign. And as a Polish Jew, he didn't know what that meant, but it meant, "You're safe, you're good with us." And so he always speaks of the power of a thumbs up sign now when he sees it. And he was taken by the United States Army and liberated and put in this displaced persons camp, which you see in this photo. After the war, Henry was able to contact a sister of his who had left Poland and made it to the United States. So Henry was able to move to the United States. She helped him sponsor him for immigration, and he began to start his life again here. And he learned English, he met his wife, and ultimately Henry ended up in the Washington, D.C. area. He lived in Bethesda, and he began to volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. and visitors to the museum could often find Henry sitting at the front desk. Despite everything that he had been through, he loved to share his story. He had been in the Auschwitz concentration camp, which put a tattoo on his arm, which designated his prisoner number. They didn't call him by his name. They referenced him as his number, and that was a very tangible thing for people to see now who had been removed from generation of that history. I first came to meet Henry when I was on a tour of the Holocaust Museum, and he spoke to my group at the end of the tour. And later on, we had a school project, which was an oral history where we had to interview people who were a generation above us and about their life experiences. And I reached out to Henry to see if he would be interested, and of course he was. And during that process, we became good friends. And even after I finished that project, I would return to the museum and visit him. And ultimately, I became a tour guide at the museum and interned here during the summers, and would often see Henry always by the desk sharing his story, and worked with him. He ultimately visited my high school, he visited my local town and the library where I was from, and really made it, or he always took the time to share his story. And one memory in particular, when Henry visited my high school, he asked me instead of him to share his story with the rest of the school. And at the end, he stood up and he had tears in his eyes, and he said he had never heard a young person recount his story back to him in person. And it was a very powerful moment for him and for myself. And it just shows, I think, the power of carrying Henry's story on to the next generation. Sorry, didn't mean to start crying.